The smell of sawdust had followed me home for so long that I stopped noticing it. It lived in my jacket, in the crease of my elbows, in the seat of my truck. 14 years of building things, framing houses, pouring concrete, watching neighborhoods rise from bare red Tennessee clay. And somehow the dust of it all had become part of my skin. That Tuesday in March, I came home at 6:30 and stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment before Diane noticed me. She was at the island, phone face down beside her coffee mug, penciling something into the small leather planner she kept near the fruit bowl. She'd always kept a planner. I used to find it endearing. This woman who wrote down dentist appointments in careful block letters, who drew little boxes next to each task and crossed them off with such satisfaction. She looked up, smiled. The smile was a half-second slower than usual, but I didn't register that then. "Sophie's in the bath," she said. "I made that lentil soup you like." I kissed her on the cheek. The kitchen smelled of cumin and warm bread. Everything was exactly as it should have been. The pot was simmering. Sophie's backpack hung on its hook by the door. A crayon drawing of a horse, her current obsession, was taped to the fridge with a blue magnet shaped like the state of Tennessee. I ladled soup into a bowl and sat at the table and thought about a permit issue on the Sycamore Ridge project, about whether I needed to bring in a second crew by April, about the cost of steel going up again. Ordinary thoughts. The scaffolding of a life that felt solid. It was only later that night, well past midnight, that I lay awake for no reason I could name. Diane was asleep beside me, her breathing slow and even. The room was dark except for the thin amber line beneath the closet door. Sophie had left the light on again. I stared at the ceiling. Something small nagged at me the way a sound does when you're not sure if you actually heard it. Something about the planner. Something about the way she'd angled it slightly before setting down her pencil. I told myself it was work stress. The permit. The steel prices. I closed my eyes. I would not sleep well for the next 6 weeks. My name is Marcus. I'm 44 years old, and I built Hargrove Construction from a 2-man operation working out of a rented garage into a company with 23 employees and a solid reputation across 3 counties. I did that in 11 years. Diane and I married when I was 30. She was 27, working in property management, sharp-minded and organized in ways I admired because I was always better with my hands than with paperwork. We met at a city planning meeting, of all places. I was there about a zoning variance. She was there representing a client. She argued her case with a quiet precision that I found immediately attractive. We were married 14 months later. Sophie came 7 years into the marriage, a late and deliberate decision that we both felt ready for. She has Diane's dark hair and my tendency to stay quiet in groups, to observe before speaking. At 9, she already knows more about horses than I know about most things. The business has a joint operations account. It always had, from the early days when Diane helped with the books before we grew enough to hire a full-time accountant. When we brought on Kevin as our CFO 3 years ago, Diane stepped back from active involvement. But her name stayed on the account. A clerical oversight, I'd thought. A detail I never revisited. That detail would cost me more than I can calculate in purely financial terms. The first week of April, Kevin asked me if I'd approved a transfer to something called Meridian Capital Consulting. "What transfer?" I said. Kevin turned his monitor toward me. "This one, and this one, and this one here." There were 11 of them, going back 4 years. I sat very still. The office around me continued its ordinary Tuesday morning. Phones ringing in the outer room. The sound of Kyle's truck pulling into the lot, coffee dripping in the break room. All of it completely normal. All of it suddenly occurring on the other side of very thick glass. "How much total?" I asked. Kevin told me. I thanked him, asked him to print the records and lock them in his desk. Told him nothing else. I drove to Clarksville's Riverview Park, pulled into the empty lot near the walking path, and sat in my truck for 40 minutes watching the Cumberland River move south. It was cold for April. A heron stood motionless in the shallows, patient as a verdict. I did not call Diane. I did not call my lawyer. I did not call anyone. I watched the heron. And quietly, the way a man who builds things understands the necessary order of a project, I began to plan. I want to be precise about the before because it matters. Not just as context, but because the before is where the truth actually lives, buried under all the ordinary days. Diane and I had a good marriage. I say that without irony and without the defensive quality that phrase sometimes carries. We didn't fight often. We ate dinner together most nights. We took Sophie to Mammoth Cave last summer, and Diane had laughed, really laughed, unselfconsciously, when Sophie insisted on narrating the entire tour in what she called her explorer voice. We still held hands at the movies. We still talked about whether to renovate the back porch, about Sophie's school, about whether I should eventually take on a partner in the business or keep it family-controlled. It was a real marriage, which is what made the math so hard to accept. The signs, in retrospect, form a line so straight it almost looks deliberate. But at the time they were just noise, the ambient static of a busy life. The planner, first. Diane had always kept one, but sometime around 2 years ago, she began keeping it in her purse rather than on the kitchen island. I noticed because I reached for it once to check the date of Sophie's spring recital, and Diane said, mildly, "It's in my bag," and retrieved it herself. She found the recital date, showed me, set it back in her bag. I thought nothing of it. The phone. She'd always been relaxed about her phone, left it charging in the kitchen, handed it to Sophie to look up horse breeds or funny animal videos. Sometime in the past 18 months, it began traveling with her. To the bathroom. To bed, screen down. She'd upgraded to a newer model last fall and set it up herself, which she'd never done before. Usually she handed it to me, impatient with the setup process. "I figured it out," she said, pleased with herself. I watched a tutorial. Diane, who had once asked me how to move photos from her phone to her laptop. The business trips. Diane had started taking on a few freelance property consulting contracts the previous year, a natural extension of her background, and I'd supported it. It gave her something that was hers, I thought. 3 times in 14 months, she'd gone out of town for site assessments. Columbus, Nashville, an hour away, which required an overnight only because, she said, the second day walkthrough started early. Chattanooga. I drove her to the Nashville hotel myself the first time. Kissed her goodbye in the drop-off lane. Texted her that night, and she replied promptly, affectionately. The next morning, she called from the car on her way home. I had no reason to question any of it. But I sit here now and I count. 3 trips, each lasting 1 to 2 nights. I count the 11 transfers. I do the arithmetic of how long a man would need to establish himself as a financial consultant with a legitimate-looking business entity if the goal was to receive laundered funds. I think about Diane's organizational mind, her planner, her careful block letters. I think about how well-suited she would have been to all of it. The friendship angle emerged around the same time the trips began. She mentioned Colton first as a professional contact, someone she'd met through a property developer she'd worked with, a financial consultant who'd been helpful with some contract questions. His name came up 3 times over 4 months in casual, unremarkable contexts. Once I even said something like, "That guy Colton again," and she said, "He knows that world well," and I moved on. I never met him. He was never proposed as someone to meet for dinner, never brought into any social context. He existed only in mentions, in passing, like a background character who'd wandered too close to the frame. My closest friend Ray, who runs an auto shop on Craft Street and has known me since we were both 22, said something to me that winter that I didn't understand until much later. We were watching college football at his place, and during a commercial he said, randomly, "You ever feel like you don't know everything about a person? Like there's whole floors of someone you've never been to?" I said, "Deep thought for a Thursday." He laughed, and the game came back on. Ray has always been uncomfortable with directness. I know that now. The week after Kevin showed me the transfer records, I did something I had never done before in 14 years of marriage. I went through Diane's things. Not frantically. Not the way a man does when he's running on panic and adrenaline. I did it the way I approach a structural problem on a job site, methodically, with a specific question in mind, looking for the answer in the materials themselves. I started with the leather planner. She kept it in her purse, but on Thursday mornings, she took Sophie to her riding lesson and left her purse on the bench by the back door while she changed into her barn boots. I had a 9-minute window, approximately. The planner was dense with notations, appointments, task lists, phone numbers annotated with initials. I photographed each page with my phone, working backward from the current month. My hands were completely steady. That surprised me. I found Colton's initials, CM, on 12 separate dates across the past 16 months. 3 corresponded exactly to her out-of-town trips. 6 were local, annotated with times. CM 11 a.m., CM Lunch, CM 2:30. Two had small asterisks beside them that she'd never used for ordinary appointments. The last page I photographed was from the previous August. At the bottom, she'd written a figure. A dollar amount, followed by a question mark, followed by what looked like a routing number, partially obscured by a coffee ring. I put the planner back. Exact position. Walked upstairs. Washed my face with cold water and looked at myself in the bathroom mirror for a long time. The figure she'd written was close, very close, to one of the transfer amounts Kevin had shown me. I drove to the job site that afternoon and ripped out 6 hours of physical work alongside my crew on the Sycamore Ridge framing, because it was either that or sit still, and sitting still felt like a trap. Meridian Capital Consulting existed. I found it in 15 minutes of searching, a registered LLC in Delaware, listed agent address, a P.O. box in Nashville. A minimal website, professional, generic, designed to look real without saying anything verifiable. A phone number that went to voicemail, a man's voice, neutral, giving only the company name. Financial consulting, investment facilitation, portfolio advisory. Colton M. I hired a private investigator named Brenda, a 51-year-old former insurance fraud specialist who came recommended by a lawyer I trusted. I did not contact the lawyer yet. I wanted information before I wanted counsel. I told Brenda what I needed. She listened without interrupting, asked 3 precise questions, wrote nothing down. She said she'd be in touch. 2 days later, she sent me a file. A real name, Colton Marsh, 38. Licensed financial consultant, legitimately, which made it worse. A Brentwood address, upscale suburb south of Nashville. No criminal record. Divorced 3 years prior. A LinkedIn profile that was carefully maintained but thin on specifics. And a photograph. He looked exactly like nothing. Medium height, light hair, the kind of face that would disappear in a group photo. I stared at the image trying to find something that would help me understand, and found nothing useful. He looked like a man who handled money. I thought about the 11 transfers. I thought about 4 years. The red herring came from an unexpected direction. Brenda flagged that 2 of the transfer amounts had been partially returned, small portions, routed through a third account before landing back in a personal savings account in Diane's name only. She'd had the account for 6 years. I hadn't known it existed. My first interpretation was that Diane was skimming from Colton, taking money from him in return for routing my business funds to him. A reverse scheme, which would have meant something fractionally different about her motives. It took me another week and another conversation with Brenda to understand what I was actually looking at. Diane was paying Colton. The returned amounts were Colton sending portions back, either as calculated gifts to maintain the relationship or to help cover the account's legitimacy. The money had flowed almost entirely in one direction, out of my business, into Colton Marsh. She wasn't being paid. She was paying him. For what? Precisely, affection, attention, the particular feeling of being wanted by a man who spoke the language of investment and portfolio and future. I cannot say with certainty. But the financial record was unambiguous. Diane had been funding another man's life with money from the company I had spent 11 years building. I sat with that knowledge for 4 days before I felt anything resembling a clear emotion. Then, at 6 in the morning on a Saturday, standing at the kitchen counter while Sophie slept upstairs and Diane's coffee mug sat empty beside the pot, I felt something click into place inside me. Cold, precise, and permanent. I called my lawyer. Meanwhile, Ray called me. Not unusual, we talked weekly. But this time there was a specific quality to his opening, a pause after the hello that I recognized as someone organizing themselves before something difficult. I need to tell you something, he said. I know, I said. Another pause. How much do you know? Enough. Tell me your part. He'd seen Diane and Colton together at a restaurant in Nashville 8 months earlier. He'd been there for a parts supplier meeting. He'd recognized Diane, watched for 5 minutes, and convinced himself it was professional because he'd wanted to convince himself. He'd spent 8 months telling himself it wasn't what it looked like. I asked him if he'd noticed anything else. He mentioned, hesitantly, that Diane had once, about a year ago, asked him, seemingly casually, whether business account structures were hard to audit. He'd thought it was a general question. He hadn't connected it to anything. We stayed on the phone for a while after that without talking much. I should have said something, Ray said finally. Yeah, I said. You should have. It wasn't an accusation. It was just the truth, and we both let it sit there. My lawyer's name is Patricia, and she is not the sort of person who wastes language. When I laid everything in front of her, Kevin's printouts, Brenda's file, the planner photographs, the account records, the Meridian LLC registration, she looked through each item in sequence and then looked at me. "You understand what this is," she said. "Tell me what I need to understand legally." She explained it carefully. Diane's name on the business account gave her authorization to make transfers, technically. But the nature of those transfers, the concealment of the receiving entity, the personal benefit to a third party with whom she had a documented personal relationship, constituted financial fraud against a business interest. Commingled with the dissolution of a marriage, it also constituted dissipation of marital assets. "How long can you keep this quiet?" Patricia asked. "As long as I need to." "Then take as long as you need. The case is stronger the more complete it is." I went home. I cooked dinner. I helped Sophie with a school project about the water cycle. I sat next to Diane on the couch while she read, and I watched television, and I did not look at her differently, because I had decided not to. Not yet. Not until the structure was complete. Patricia began filing the documentation framework. Brenda continued compiling. I requested a forensic accounting consultation, quietly, through a firm in Nashville, and a forensic accountant named Douglas began working through 4 years of business records. Douglas found 3 things I hadn't found myself. First, the transfers had been timed to coincide with periods of peak business cash flow, end of quarter, post-project settlement. Someone with knowledge of my billing cycles had helped plan this. Diane had that knowledge. She'd helped with the books in the early years and had absorbed the rhythms of the business even after stepping back. Second, there was a second LLC. Smaller, newer, incorporated 18 months ago. Also Delaware. Also a P.O. box. Also connected, through a chain of 2 intermediary accounts, to Colton Marsh. Diane had signed as an officer. She hadn't just sent money. She had co-created the infrastructure. Third, and this is the one that cost me a night of sleep I could not recover. 3 of the transfers had cleared within 48 hours of major business milestones. A new contract signing, an equipment purchase I was proud of, a conversation Diane and I had at dinner about the company's strongest fiscal quarter in 3 years. She had listened to me describe my own success and then transferred money out of it within 2 days. The red herring I'd been carrying resolved itself around this time, and a new complication emerged in its place. Douglas found that a small number of the returned funds, Colton's partial repayments, had been moved into a college savings account in Sophie's name. Not enough to matter financially. Enough to matter in every other way. I didn't know what to do with that. Part of me still doesn't. Patricia advised that I document it and say nothing. Whatever Diane's reasoning, guilt, calculation, genuine maternal concern running alongside everything else, it would be addressed in proceedings. I nodded and said I understood and drove to Sophie's school that afternoon to pick her up and watched her walk across the parking lot with her backpack and her horseprint sneakers and her expression of complete ordinary 9-year-old absorption, and I said nothing, because some architecture has to be kept intact no matter what's happening to the rest of the building. My brother-in-law Dennis, Diane's younger brother, called in the 5th week. Dennis works in Charlotte, comes through Clarksville a few times a year. We've always gotten along. He asked if Diane seemed off to me lately, said she'd seemed distracted the last time they'd spoken. I said I hadn't noticed anything specific. She asked me about legal stuff. Dennis said, like divorce process stuff. I figured you two were maybe having a hard stretch. I asked what she'd wanted to know. How assets get divided. Whether a business could be split. I told her I didn't know, and she dropped it. I thanked him. We talked for a few more minutes about nothing important. She was planning, too. She had been for a while, probably. Whatever she thought this was, an exit, a transition, a parallel life she'd been quietly building. She'd started preparing for the legal dimension. She just hadn't started fast enough. By the end of week 6, I had everything Patricia said I needed. Possibly more. I made dinner reservations for a Saturday night. Our usual place, a steakhouse on Riverside where we'd celebrated our anniversary more than once. I told Diane I wanted a night out, just us. She seemed pleased. She wore the blue dress she knew I liked. We talked through dinner easily. She ordered the salmon. I had the ribeye. We shared a bottle of a Malbec we both liked, and she told me a funny story about a difficult client, and I laughed in the right places. The evening was completely ordinary. The last ordinary evening. I had decided that I would not do it in anger. I would not do it in a restaurant or in front of Sophie or in any moment that would later become a scene. I would do it clearly, at home, with documentation in hand, and I would not raise my voice. Sunday morning. Sophie had a birthday party 2 streets over. I put the folder on the kitchen table while Diane was pouring her second cup of coffee. She saw it and went still. The folder was thick, not theatrically thick, just comprehensive. It sat there, ordinary and catastrophic. Sit down, I said. I didn't say it harshly. I said it the way I give instructions on a job site, because I'd learned long ago that calm carries more authority than volume. She sat. She set her coffee cup down. She did not look at the folder. Do you want to start? I said. Or should I? Silence. For seconds of it. I counted. Marcus. Meridian Capital Consulting, I said. Delaware, LLC. Colton Marsh, sole beneficiary. 11 transfers from our business operations account over 4 years. $163,000. I paused. Then there's the second entity. 18 months old. You're listed as an officer. She had gone the color of the white kitchen wall. And the personal savings account, I continued. 6 years old. I never knew it existed. Which means you opened it before any of this started, which tells me something about how long you've been keeping separate architecture. The word architecture landed. I watched her register it. How did you? She stopped. It doesn't matter how. What matters is that I've known for 6 weeks. The documents are with my attorney. A forensic accountant has completed his report, and I have a private investigator's file on Colton Marsh going back 20 months. She looked at her hands, then at the folder, then at me. I'm going to ask you one question, I said. And I want the truth not because it changes anything legally. It doesn't. But because after 14 years I think I've earned one honest answer. I waited. Was any of it, the money, the trips, all of it, was any of it about giving him what I didn't give you? Or was it just money? She didn't answer for a long time. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside, a neighbor's dog barked twice and stopped. It wasn't just money, she said finally. But it wasn't just him either. What does that mean? She looked up. Her eyes were dry. I had expected tears. I had steeled myself against tears. The absence of them told me more than any answer. I felt invisible, she said. For years. You built everything. And you were proud of it. And I think that was the problem. You were so proud of it. And I was just, she stopped. I was just someone who lived in it. I thought about the cumin soup. The crayon horse on the refrigerator. The anniversary dinners at the steakhouse. The Malbec. So, you took money from the thing I built, I said. Because you felt invisible inside it. She had no response to that. She didn't try to make one. I want you to understand something, I said. This wasn't a mistake. Mistakes happen once. This was a system. You built a system, Diane. With accounts and entities and timing. For 4 years. I kept my voice level. That's not invisible. That's a choice made over and over again. She began, then, to cry. But slowly, carefully. The way someone cries when they know they have no claim to sympathy. I stood up and picked up the folder. My lawyer will contact you by Wednesday, I said. I've made arrangements for Sophie to stay with my mother this week. I'll be here. You should find somewhere else. She looked at me. Really looked. The way you look at something you're seeing clearly for the first time after a long period of partial vision. Marcus, she said. I'm sorry. I know, I said. I walked out of the kitchen and went upstairs. I sat on the edge of our bed and looked at the thin amber line beneath the closet door and listened to the sound of the refrigerator humming downstairs and, after a while, the sound of Diane moving, getting up, leaving the kitchen. I didn't feel victory. I didn't feel rage. I felt the specific exhaustion of a man who has spent 6 weeks building something very carefully and has now set it in motion and has to wait for gravity to do the rest. The proceedings took 8 months. Patricia was precise, methodical, and utterly relentless in a way that never felt emotional, just structural. The forensic accounting report was admitted. The LLC documentation was admitted. Brenda's file was admitted. Diane's attorney tried 3 different angles of counterargument, and Patricia addressed each one without apparent effort. Colton Marsh was deposed. He was exactly as unremarkable in person as in his photograph. Cooperative, careful, legally insulated. Meridian Capital had structured things in a way that made his criminal liability unclear enough that prosecution was impractical. My lawyer explained this early, so I wouldn't spend energy on it. The business is the vehicle, Patricia said. We go after what was taken. what was taken, with interest, penalties, and the forensic valuation of Diane's co-officer role in the second LLC, came to a judgment that covered the full transferred amount plus legal costs, plus a percentage of the marital home equity that accounted for the assessed harm to the business. Diane did not contest the final agreement. Her attorney advised her that contesting it would make things worse. She moved to Nashville. I don't know the address. I didn't ask. Sophie knows her parents are divorced. She does not know the full story, and she won't. Not for a long time. Maybe not ever in complete detail. She stays with me 4 nights a week and spends the other 3 with Diane. And whatever else Diane failed at, she shows up for those 3 nights. That matters. I've decided to let it matter because Sophie needs it too. My daughter drew me a horse last month. She said it was the strongest horse because it had been through the most. She explained, with complete 9-year-old seriousness, that the strongest horses always have scars you can't see. I put it on the refrigerator with a blue magnet shaped like the state of Tennessee. The business is fine. Better than fine. The Sycamore Ridge project was our most profitable of the year, and I've brought in a partner, a structural engineer named Walt who handles the growth I used to run alone. Kevin is still CFO. The operations account has a new signatory structure that Patricia recommended. No secondary names. No clerical oversights. Ray and I still watch football on Thursdays. We don't talk about the year we lost talking to each other. We don't need to. The back porch renovation I'd been discussing with Diane for 3 years. I did it myself, last October, in 4 weekends with Ray's help and Sophie handing us tools and narrating the process in her explorer voice. It came out better than I'd expected. The wood is a pale cedar that catches the afternoon light in a way I didn't anticipate. I sit out there in the evenings sometimes when Sophie is asleep, and I drink coffee, and I look at the yard and the tree line, and I think about what it means to build something that is entirely yours. There is a specific quality to that feeling. I didn't have a name for it before. I have one now. Colton Marsh's LinkedIn profile was updated 6 months after the proceedings concluded. New city. New firm name. He still looks like nothing in his profile photo. Still smiles like a man who handles money and considers the handling sufficient. I looked at the profile once. I haven't looked since. Some things are exactly what they appear to be. The danger is in deciding they can't possibly be. The last thing Diane said to me that wasn't through lawyers was in the parking lot of Sophie's school, 3 months after she moved out. We'd both come to pick up and arrived at the same time and stood beside our cars for a moment in the ordinary autumn afternoon light. She said, I think I told myself it didn't count, because the money was going somewhere. Like it had a purpose. I thought about that for a moment. Most dishonesty has a purpose, I said. That's the whole point of it. She nodded slowly. Sophie came through the doors then, saw us both, and ran toward us with the uncomplicated happiness of a child who has not yet learned that the adults around her carry whole hidden floors she cannot access. I caught her, lifted her, felt the weight of her, concrete and real. That was the last ordinary Tuesday. Now most Tuesdays are ordinary again. That's enough. That's exactly enough. What this story reveals, more than anything else, is how completely trust can function as camouflage. Marcus spent 14 years building a life that felt structurally sound, and it was, in almost every material sense, except for the one variable he had stopped examining. Diane's name on the business account had been a clerical oversight, he believed. That belief was not naive exactly. It was the natural product of a marriage in which he had no reason to audit his own assumptions. And that is perhaps the first and most quietly devastating red flag the story offers. The moment Diane stepped back from the books and Marcus simply never revisited the access she retained. He did not ignore a warning. He ignored a question he didn't think to ask. The second red flag, more visible in retrospect, was the planner. Small, domestic, easy to misread, but the behavior around it changed, and behavior around ordinary objects changes for reasons. The phone followed the same pattern. Diane did not become secretive all at once. She became secretive in increments, each small enough to dismiss individually, collectively forming an architecture of concealment that matched, structurally, the financial one she'd built in Delaware. What makes this psychologically interesting is that the concealment was never panicked. It was organized, which suggests that Diane had, somewhere in herself, separated her life into compartments with real walls between them, and had done so without visible emotional distress. That kind of compartmentalization doesn't happen quickly. It develops as a practice skill. The story turns definitively at two moments. The first is Kevin's Tuesday morning question, not because the information was new, but because it converted something diffuse and unnamed into something with a dollar figure and a paper trail. Marcus had no suspicion before that moment, and what he experienced was not the confirmation of a fear, but the sudden arrival of a completely new reality. The second turning point is subtler and more psychologically significant: the Sunday morning confrontation. Marcus had prepared for tears, for deflection, for anger. What he got instead was a composed, considered explanation: "I felt invisible," and dry eyes. The absence of tears told him that Diane had made her peace with this version of herself long before the conversation happened. She had not been waiting to be caught. She had been waiting for something to end. That distinction carries a lesson that extends beyond the particulars of this story. The more dangerous betrayals are not the impulsive ones: passion, a weak moment, a bad decision made once and not again. The dangerous betrayals are the administrative ones. The ones that get scheduled in careful block letters in a leather planner. The ones built on LLC filings and routing numbers and the timed exploitation of someone's most successful quarters. Those betrayals require a sustained decision to continue, renewed each time. And what Marcus ultimately confronted was not the question of whether Diane loved him, but the more difficult question of how many times, over 4 years, she had looked at him across the kitchen table and chosen to continue anyway. The college savings account, the small amount Colton returned, moved by Diane into Sophie's fund, is the story's most morally complex detail, and it resists clean interpretation. Was it guilt made practical? An attempt to rationalize the harm by redirecting some benefit toward the child? Or something more human and less calculated? A mother keeping two lives from colliding, trying to protect something real inside something false. The story does not resolve this. It shouldn't. Real psychology rarely resolves neatly at the edges, and the detail's ambiguity is what makes it honest. Marcus's response, the 6 weeks of silence, the methodical documentation, the careful dinner reservation the night before, reflects a man who understands that anger is most powerful when it is converted into structure. He built a case the way he builds a house: foundation first, framing next, nothing visible until everything is load-bearing. That discipline is admirable and also, in some way, lonely. To carry knowledge that large, in complete silence, while cooking dinner and helping with water cycle homework and sitting on a couch watching television, that requires a particular kind of internal architecture, too. Marcus had built his own compartments. The difference is what he put in them. What the story ultimately demonstrates is the slow, compound cost of being assumed rather than seen. Both Diane and Marcus failed at this, though in profoundly asymmetric ways. Marcus assumed the marriage was sound because its surfaces were intact: dinner, conversation, Sophie's drawings on the fridge, the comfortable weight of shared routine. Diane assumed her discontent was a private matter that could be managed privately, through systems and accounts, and a man in Nashville who made her feel like the subject of attention rather than the background of someone else's success story. Neither assumption was examined. Both were catastrophically wrong. The accumulation at the center of this story is not just financial. It is the accumulation of small, unasked questions, of instincts redirected, of discomfort quietly filed away by two people who each, in different ways, preferred the functioning surface to the difficult conversation beneath it. By the time any of it became visible, for years had passed, and the structure Diane had built was as complete as the one Marcus had built, just invisible, and pointed in a different direction entirely. The point of no return, in this story, was not a single dramatic moment. It was the second transfer, the third, each one a decision, each one making the next easier to make, until the accumulated weight of all of them made any other outcome structurally impossible. What trust requires, and what this story makes painfully clear, is not vigilance. That's not love. That's surveillance. What trust requires is the ongoing willingness to remain curious about the person beside you. Not suspicious, curious. The question Marcus never asked was not, "Are you lying to me?" but simply, "What do you need that I'm not seeing?" It may not have changed the outcome, but it would have changed the silence. What stays with me about this story is not the betrayal itself. It's the discipline of it. The planner. The timing of the transfers. The second, LLC. There's something in that level of organization that goes beyond an affair of the heart into something that requires you to sit with the person you're deceiving every evening, set the table, pour the wine, and choose to continue. That's the part that's hardest to hold. Not the falling, but the staying fallen, deliberately, day after day, in someone else's kitchen. I think the real question this story asks, quietly, without ever stating it directly, is not how do we catch the people who deceive us, but what does it cost a person to maintain a deception for 4 years? What does it do to you to live that way? Whatever Diane found with Colton, she paid for it in ways that have nothing to do with the court's judgment. Some of those costs are invisible. Most of them she'll carry alone.